Good morning, folks. This is our 10th or 11th week in quarantine or during this entire lockdown time. And this is the very first week where I have struggled a bit to come up with a devotional to share with you. And here's why. Because I could take a passage of scripture and I could talk about it. That's not a problem. I can do that all day long because I think scripture is amazing. I love it and I love to talk about it. I love to explain it and I love to use story to do it. And so it's not for lack of material. The reason that I struggled a bit today is because there's so many things that are going on out there that are worth talking about. And I sometimes don't know which of those things to discuss with you. This is one of those weeks where my heart and my spirit feel like there are things to say, and I've had to kind of have a conversation with myself to say, should I go there or shouldn't I? Well, I'm going to go there today. No caveats. I've thought a lot about this. I've prayed about this, and this is where I feel like I need to go. And if it's something that you want to talk more about, then I always welcome further conversation. Please know that. I want to first start out by reading you a story from John chapter 8. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." This is an incredible story. This is one of my favorite stories of Jesus interacting with people in Scripture. And so let's just set the scene. It's kind of a day for Jesus where he's teaching in the temple courts, and the religious leaders bring in a woman. And most likely this woman is mostly naked because she's been caught in the act of adultery. And if you've been caught in the act of adultery, well, you're being drugged out of your home, out of your bedroom. There's not a lot of time left to put things like clothes on. And so they have taken this woman and they have intentionally embarrassed her by drawing her into public pretty much in the nude. They've also embarrassed Jesus by throwing this partially clothed woman at Jesus's feet. And all of this is set up to try and trap Jesus, try and get him to say something against the law of Moses. It's clear. The law of Moses tells us to do this with an adulterous woman. What do you say we should do, Jesus? You're supposed to be the teacher of the law. You claim to be the Messiah, the fulfillment of the law. So how could you say anything that is not in line with the law? So this whole thing is a trap. Well, Jesus doesn't immediately say anything. He just kind of kneels down there and he begins to draw in the dirt, and then he gets up to respond. And who does he face when he gets up? The woman who is kind of probably kneeling on the ground. She's probably kind of huddled. She's covering herself as best as she can. And there's a crowd surrounding her. And the men in the crowd, specifically the men, have picked up rocks because the law says we kill her. We stone her for this offense. So they've picked up rocks. They're prepared to, be trial and, judge, jury, and executioner. And so they're prepared to throw these rocks at her and kill her. And so they're waiting for Jesus to say, "Go ahead." But when Jesus stands up, he kind of flips the whole thing on its head. He says, "Tell you what, if you haven't sinned, let the person who hasn't sinned cast the first stone." Because Jesus recognizes that there is no one without sin. He'd be the only one standing there in that courtyard in that moment that was sinless. So you who haven't sinned, cast the first stone. And they begin to drop their stones and walk away, starting with the older men, because the older men, being a bit wiser, being a bit more long in their years, recognize that they're definitely not without sin. It would be a younger, impetuous man that would even think for a second, well, I've been a good boy. I followed those rules. But everybody ends up walking away. Jesus stands up and talks to the woman and says, "Woman, where are your accusers? Is there no one left to condemn you?" And she says, "No." He says, "Well, then neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." And so when I talk about this passage, the first thing I want to say is there's definitely clearly right things and wrong things. And so nothing I'm about to say should give you any kind of idea that I'm saying, hey, there's nothing wrong out there. Here's what I want to say. Have you ever thought about who Jesus was the hardest on? When Jesus came to this earth in his time of ministry, when he walked this earth, when he talked with people, when he preached to people, when he brought the hammer down, as he did sometimes, and even in this moment, he speaks softly, but boy, does he carry a big stick in this moment, right? He says things like, if you haven't sinned, then you may cast the first stone. Who's Jesus hardest on? The people that Jesus is hardest on are the religious elite. All right, so the Pharisees, the Sadducees, these are the ones that bear the brunt of Jesus's frustration with where things are at. And who are the religious elite today? Let's just transfer this. The religious elite today might be people who teach, who are pastors, who are elders, who hold some sort of position of authority in the church of some kind. And then who else was Jesus really hard on? Let's say after the religious elite, then who? Well, then it was the culturally elite. Jesus was pretty hard on the Jewish people because the Jewish people culturally, they're in. This is their Messiah. This is their religion. And so when Jesus comes and has hard things to say, he starts first with the Jewish religious elite, those who are leading. And then he starts with the culturally elite. Now, again, today, who are those people? Well, the religious elite and the cultural elite, these are the people who think they're in. They're the ones who think they have it right. They're the ones who think they know what is right. And so what I want to challenge you on today is I want to challenge you to consider whether or not you have it right. You see, we as believers, as the church, we tend to be pretty judgmental. We do a really good job. We find it pretty easy to cast our judgmental looks and our judgmental words on the people around us who do things, say things, or believe in things that we don't agree with. We call them names. We talk about them. We gossip about them. We look down upon them, and we judge them. We put ourselves in the seat of judgment for the people that we don't agree with, we don't like, and we don't see eye to eye with. Just like these people who brought a woman. And by the way, this whole thing is probably made up because there's no man. The man should be stoned along with the woman according to the law of Moses. But do they drag a man out and a woman out and throw them at Jesus' feet? No, they just drag a woman out. So these are probably trumped up charges. Put that aside for a moment. The people who gather holding their rocks, these are the people who think they're in the right. They're the ones who think they know what's going on. They're the ones who think that they're in. Who thinks they're in our world today? Usually it's the people who are inside the church, not the people who are outside the church. We have another thing coming sometimes. We have to remember that if Jesus came today and he walked this earth for 3 years doing his ministry, preaching and teaching the word and the gospel, he would have hard words to say to the people who are inside the church, people who claim to follow him, more than he would have hard words to say for the people who didn't. And that's not, again, me saying that people who don't follow Jesus, everything they do is okay and it's right. What I'm saying is, those of us inside the church need to stop being so judgmental about those who are outside the church, those who we don't agree with, and those who don't believe the same things. Now, this takes me to a whole nother topic, but it's related. Jesus was hard on the culturally elite. Most of you know that I have biracial children. I have been blessed to be an adoptive father, and my children are biracial. And I feel so odd sometimes talking about racial issues because I am a middle-class white male. It doesn't get much more privileged than me. But my kids are not going to know that same privilege because of the color of their skin. And so while our churches are filled with people who are shouting from the rooftops about their rights, once again this week, another black man died at the hands of police. You know what terrifies me? That someday my son will make the mistake of doing something that lands him in that same position. Not because I think that cops are bad. I'm so thankful for them, and I have some very good friends who are in law enforcement. But there is a racial divide. There is a cultural elitism that exists in our world today, and Jesus would shout from the rooftops about this. And so I want to close with a passage from Amos. Amos is a prophet, and you'll find the book of Amos near the end of the Old Testament. Amos says this to those on the inside, speaking on behalf of God. I despise your religious feasts. I cannot stand your assemblies. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. My friends, there are things that we should be indignant about. There are things that we should be upset about. There are things that we should be shouting from the rooftop about. But it might not be about the things we think. If Jesus came today, would you be one who thinks they're in the right? One who thinks that they're in? Or would you be one on the outside, looking in? Would Jesus have harder words to say to you about the things that you've been saying, about the things that you've been shouting? Scripture talks about a day of judgment. I wholeheartedly believe that day will one day come. But you know what the criteria for judgment is? It's not your church attendance. It is not how often you attended Sunday school. It's not how much you put in the offering plate. It's not how often you spent time mowing the grass at church. The day of judgment, the criteria, has to do with how you loved your neighbor. Who is my neighbor, Lord? And then he tells a story about a man, a Jewish man, who was beaten and robbed, who was cared for and rescued, not by a priest, one of the religious elite, not by a Levite, someone who thought they were in, but by someone from a different culture, whose skin looked a little bit different, who took the time and the money and the risk to bandage his wounds. The criteria on Judgment Day is how you love your neighbor. It's if you've cared for the poor, the orphan, the widow, and the sick. What words does Jesus have for you today?